Payton was a 6.5-year-old deer. He was our #1 hit lister. We put a ton of time and effort into getting this deer. And I would have never dreamed how this story was going to end. Payton showed up in 2019. He was a 3.5-year-old 8-pointer. Didn't really pay much attention. There's a lot of deer in that range, 2.5, 3.5, and so we weren't taking much focus on those specific deer. But he was a deer that wasn't really a core deer for our property. He was hanging more off property, kind of on the neighbors, a little bit north, a little bit west, and he would show up late in the season.
As we headed into the winter months, shed season, it's like which bucks survived. We did our first ever shed hunt on the property, on this Whitetail from Scratch property. And Chris ended up having some pretty good success. He found a few sheds, and one of them was this 4-point side, ended up being one of the sheds from Payton.
In 2020, as a 4.5, he showed up, and we noticed that he had a pretty good frame to him. And he happened to be showing up on this pond dike, and he was an 8-pointer, so we were trying to get a name for him, and we were going back and forth on it, and I was just trying to think of, well, he shows up at the pond, he is an 8, a pond 8, Payton, hey, let's call him Payton.
And in 2020, that's when we actually extended the property a little bit. We purchased another additional adjoining piece of property, and it all really had the same core area. So it was a big, crucial piece that really functioned well with what we already had. And the 2021 season was really a year of high anticipation. We knew we had potentially a 6.5-year-old deer in Skyscraper, a 5.5 in Little Splitter, and a 5.5 in a buck we call Payton. Having multiple mature bucks to actually hunt that year, we knew our odds were increased, and we were just excited to get after it. So the entire off season, that entire summer, it was all about food plot strategies, stand locations, water holes. We put a lot of improvements into the property through a Whitetail from Scratch series, and we were ready for the season. What we've noticed for these first couple seasons on our property is we don't have a lot of big mature bucks early in the year. We have a lot of thick cover, a lot of bedding, and a lot of food that we're putting in for the late season. So really the property gets better as the season progresses and as our food sources are the most sought after in the area. And that's really when these big mature bucks become more regular. They're using our food plot systems, they're starting to use our late season standing grain, and we have some of the best bedding in the whole area. So that's when the property for us is really prime and at its best. And late in the season is really when we see these mature bucks come in from surrounding properties and make themselves home.
So as a 5.5 in 2021, Payton makes the hit list. Now, still wasn't paying a lot of attention to that deer because we had a deer called Skyscraper who was #1 on the hit list. And JJ managed to take that deer. It was the very first deer that we had taken off the property. And he took him in November, and it wasn't maybe a week or two later, I'm hunting not only for Little Splitter, but also for Payton in the same area. And so I end up taking Little Splitter. At that point, there becomes a void. 2 of the most dominant deer on the property have now been removed. And Payton starts to learn that he's the #1 deer in the area.
So heading into the 2022 season, Payton is a 6.5-year-old buck. That's what I consider an ultra mature deer. 6, 7, 8. That's about that upper end of any mature buck across the country, really. So it's exciting to get a deer that old that's using our property that we would consider like a homebody buck. And really, again, it comes down to off-season strategy. So this is the year where the Illusion food plot systems were actually the finalized product that we now have on market today. This property was the testing grounds for these systems. So, we're planting prime time, 4 seasons, easy greens. Across the whole property, we're filling this thing up with micro plot strategies, bedding areas, and it's making a huge difference. And we're really excited because we know some of these spots, these little micro plots, are going to be just dynamite killer spots for big bucks like this.
Payton, he's definitely the #1 shooter. We know that, okay? He's 6.5-year-old buck, big frame. He actually became a 9-point at the time as well. And he becomes patternable. He's showing up on the property. We're using our new food plot, our micro plot strategies, and with the other 2 deer leaving in the advanced habitat that we're putting in this property, he now has become kind of the core deer, and he's staying there all season long.
So 22 was definitely a chess match and a grinder. I know my dad had a few experiences, and even my brother and myself out, where you might be in one stand and all of a sudden he's on another part of the property, and it's kind of a little bit of back and forth. Sometimes he was there and we knew he was there and we just couldn't get him close enough to even get him really on film.
November 7th, we got some great video of him. We weren't in the stand at that time, but Payton was using a water hole on what we call hidden plot. Came in with a hot dough, took a drink. He's using this area and it could be any moment, any day that we could get a crack at Payton. And then November 11th, Payton comes into OR Bottom, one of our premier filming and hunting locations. It's just a nice setup place with our primetime brassicas. Really showcased himself as the dominant mature buck in this area, daylighting on our food plot. We really began to bounce around trying to get one step ahead of Payton, but it seemed like we were always just one move off. And it wasn't until November 12th when another mature buck, actually the second oldest buck in this area, showed back up. We call him Curly Fry. And all we see is Payton's antlers. He comes down the hill from the bedding ridge, big white mainframe 8. And right as he walks off camera, all you hear is this giant smash. And what we assumed happened was Payton just took out Curly Fry, because we didn't see Curly Fry the rest of the season, and Payton took over this area and was basically the most mature dominant buck. And the calendar turned from November into December. That's when we typically see heavy snowfalls up here in Minnesota, and the deers really shift from any type of green food source into the grain. The deer had just been piling into this location, so I snuck into the backside of a redneck ghillie blind and got ready for the night. And right at last light, sure enough, Payton shows up 60 yards and he's out there eating beans just too far for a shot. In the back of our mind, we're thinking, 7.5 years old, that's a pretty mature, pretty big buck in most cases. So even if we don't get him these last few weeks, we're really looking forward to not only picking up his sheds, but hunting him in the 2023 season.
So the season's over now, and we know we got a lot of habitat work to do. It's like the first or second week in January, and we're getting the timber guys in there. I think we took out like 220 trees. It was a very aggressive move, and it's all about habitat and getting it so that it's not wide open.
And for months we'd had the loggers lined up to schedule, come in after the season was kind of our plan. Let's drop a bunch of trees, do this timber harvest, kind of thicken up this bedding area. And we know we're gonna disturb the deer quite a bit doing this, but we feel like if we can get in and out, maybe in a couple weeks or a month, I think the deer are gonna come back during the spring months, late winter, spring months. We're still probably gonna get a pretty good shed hunt out of the property this year. So, we timed it where that first week in January, we went out with the loggers to try to mark some trees and kind of game plan this whole operation.
All of a sudden I get a text from JJ, and I look down at my phone and he goes, "I just found Payton." And I'm thinking to myself, no way, we lost Payton. And so he told me where he was, and I walked up there and we met and kind of looked him over, and it was kind of, I was so stunned.
I'm kind of in shock. We just had some pictures and videos of this buck just over a week ago, and now he's laying here dead. No sign of blood, no sign of injury. So just kind of shocked and confused at the whole thing.
Here's this deer, dominant, big, healthy, huge buck. We had plenty of food in the area, and there he lay dead. And so we looked over the deer, and there's no sign of foul play. There's nothing. And after we assess it a little bit, we realized that you got that open cover, So if there's predators, they could be running him. And then this just perfect storm with the weather happened. It happened to be 30 below the night before. And it's not so much just the temperature, but there was humidity. There was humidity in this cold weather, which is very uncommon. And it penetrates your skin. It just penetrates your body, your core. And what happens is when you get a big old buck like that, and this is just my theory, he wore himself down because when we did do the recovery, there wasn't an ounce of fat on him. So he wears himself down. There's no fat on this deer. He gets this super cold weather. We didn't have good thermal cover or anything going on in this timber. And I think he just either died of a heart attack, being pushed around, no energy. He's still after the does. That's the priority. There's plenty of food there, but he's not going to the food because his priority were the does. So was there too many does? I don't know. It really was a very big disappointment. I was really bummed out.
And it really came to no surprise when the neighbor sent me a text message a few weeks later, and the other mature buck in the area we called Curly Fry, a 5.5-year-old buck. The neighbor found him dead, buried in snow as well. So this harsh winter took out the 2 most mature dominant bucks in the area, so it's kind of a rebuilding year moving forward. Regardless of us harvesting him or somebody else shooting him, just being able to experience those 4 years of history with this deer and all the learnings you can get from a mature buck like this. Like, we know where this buck was bedded, we know how we use food plots, we can look at all the data that we collected over that time, and that's just gonna make us better as hunters in the future when a buck with a similar personality or a similar age class is on the property, in these same conditions. We basically have a good indicator at what that deer is gonna do. So, it's not all bad. Just because we don't shoot a deer doesn't mean it's a total, complete loss or failure. I mean, I think there's a lot that can be learned from this deer and a lot that can be learned from all the mature bucks we've, followed in the past. And that's what makes us better as hunters, is just continually learning from deer like Payton. We have a great class of younger bucks that are working their way up into maturity, and we're ready for the season.